pedestrian that so many presume to understand the tale of Gellert Grindelwald, yet know nothing of what transpired after his defeat. They celebrate Dumbledore's victory in 1945 as though it were the conclusion of a chapter, when in truth it was merely the turning of a page in a far more complex narrative. The masses know only what they have been permitted to know, the comfortable lies, the simplified mythology. But you have come seeking something more substantial, have you not? Very well. Let us pierce the veil of half-truths and examine what the history books conveniently omit. The story of Gellert Grindelwald did not end with his duel against Albus Dumbledore atop Nurmengard, that fortress prison he himself had constructed in his hubris. No, that defeat was merely the beginning of a different kind of existence, one that would span decades in solitude, and one that would culminate in a moment of profound consequence during the darkest hour of the Wizarding World's most recent conflict. Settle yourself. This will require patience. Picture, if you possess the imagination, the scene in the aftermath of that legendary duel, 1945. The non-magical world had just concluded its second catastrophic war, though few wizards paid it much attention beyond the unfortunate overlap with Grindelwald's own campaigns. The so-called Dark Lord of his generation, how that title would later be appropriated by another, lesser wizard, had been vanquished, not killed, mind you. Dumbledore, ever the sentimental fool, could not bring himself to end the life of the man he had once. But I digress. Grindelwald was not executed. He was not handed over to any ministry, though several clamored for that dubious honor. The British Ministry of Magic, the Magical Congress of the United States, the International Confederation of Wizards, all desired their pound of flesh, their opportunity to parade the defeated Dark Lord before their constituents as proof of their power and justice. Dumbledore refused them all. Instead, the victor made a choice that would perplex historians for generations. He imprisoned Grindelwald in the very fortress the Dark Wizard had built to house his own enemies. No, that imposing structure carved into an Austrian mountain peak, bearing above its entrance those words that would become infamous for the greater good. Grindelwald's own slogan, his justification for every atrocity, now serving as his daily reminder of how thoroughly he had failed. The symbolism was not lost on Grindelwald himself, I assure you. The man possessed a formidable intellect, whatever his other failings, to be confined within walls he had designed, behind wards he had crafted, surrounded by the very architecture meant to break the spirits of his opponents. There was a peculiar poetry to it, a punishment that transcended mere physical confinement. But Dumbledore's reasoning extended beyond poetic justice. You see, Grindelwald could not be trusted to any conventional prison. He had spent years studying ancient magic, mastering arts that most wizards dismissed as theoretical or impossible. He had possessed the Elder Wand, the Death Stick, the Wand of Destiny for decades, and though Dumbledore had claimed it in their duel, the knowledge Grindelwald had accumulated through its use remained. Any ordinary prison would have proven inadequate. Any conventional guards would have been insufficient. So Nurmengard it was, and Dumbledore himself modified the wards, layer upon layer of protective enchantments, that made the fortress truly inescapable. He added to Grindelwald's own considerable defenses, creating a magical prison that was, quite possibly, the most secure location in the entire wizarding world. More secure than Azkaban, with its dementors and its sea-swept isolation. More impenetrable than the Department of Mysteries. A cage worthy of holding the most dangerous wizard of the 20th century. Until, of course, another claimed that title. Now cast your mind forward through time. The years immediately following Grindelwald's imprisonment. The 1950s, the 60s, the 70s. Decades of silence from Nermangard's highest tower cell. While the wizarding world rebuilt itself, while it attempted to forget the horrors of Grindelwald's war, the man himself sat in solitude. No visitors, Dumbledore ensured that. No correspondence, no contact with the outside world whatsoever. The only human interaction Grindelwald experienced came from the single guard assigned to deliver food and water through a slot in the cell door. Even that guardian was rotated monthly, specifically to prevent any relationship from forming, any opportunity for manipulation. One might wonder, and you should wonder, if you possess any intellectual curiosity whatsoever, what such isolation does to a mind. Grindelwald had been many things: charismatic, brilliant, ambitious, ruthless. He had commanded the loyalty of thousands. He had reshaped the magical landscape of Europe. He had very nearly succeeded in establishing his vision of wizard dominance over non-magical humans. And then nothing. Silence. Stone walls. The passage of empty days stretching into empty years. Most wizards would have descended into madness. Indeed, I suspect that was precisely what many expected. What some perhaps hoped for. A gradual dissolution of that formidable intellect. A reduction of the once great Grindelwald to a gibbering shell. It would have been tidy, convenient, the final defeat made complete. But Grindelwald was not most wizards. Instead, he thought, he reflected, he reconsidered. Those who knew him in his youth, and precious few, still lived. Who could make that claim spoke of a young man consumed by certainty. Grindelwald had been utterly convinced of his righteousness, his vision, his destiny to reshape the world according to his will. He had worn his conviction like armor, impenetrable and absolute. Decades of imprisonment, however, have a way of eroding certainty. When one has nothing but time, nothing but one's own thoughts for company, even the most rigid beliefs begin to bend under their own weight. Grindelwald began to question. Not his abilities, never that, but his choices, his methods, his fundamental understanding of what he had sought to achieve. The historical record, such as it is, suggests that somewhere in those silent years, Grindelwald experienced something that most would consider impossible for a wizard of his temperament. Remorse. Not the performative, strategic variety that some prisoners display in hopes of leniency. True remorse. The kind that gnaws at one's soul in the depths of night. The kind that forces one to confront the full weight of one's actions without the comfortable buffer of justification. He had ordered deaths, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, when one accounted for the full scope of his war. He had tortured, he had manipulated, he had torn families apart and set nation against nation, all for the greater good, as he had told himself. All to prevent a worse future, one he had foreseen in his seer's visions. But sitting in his cell, with decades to reconsider, those justifications began to ring hollow. Did he deserve credit for this evolution? That is not for me to determine. I am merely recounting facts, not rendering moral judgments. Though I will note with a certain dry appreciation that it takes a particular kind of strength to admit to oneself that one's entire life's work was fundamentally misguided. Most people lack that strength. They cling to their mistakes, doubling down rather than acknowledging error. Grindelwald, whatever else he was, possessed that particular courage. While Grindelwald contemplated his failures in isolation, the wizarding world moved forward. Britain, in particular, entered what many believed would be an era of peace and prosperity. The defeat of Grindelwald had established Dumbledore as the greatest wizard of the age, and his presence at Hogwarts provided a sense of security. Surely, people reasoned, lightning would not strike twice. Surely, one generation would not produce two Dark Lords. How spectacularly wrong they were. Tom Riddle, Lord Voldemort, as he styled himself with characteristic grandiosity, began his rise to power in the late 1960s and early 70s. His approach differed fundamentally from Grindelwald's, where Grindelwald had been a revolutionary, seeking to overturn the entire statute of secrecy and establish wizard dominance openly. Voldemort was a supremacist focused primarily on blood purity within magical society itself. Where Grindelwald had built a movement based on ideology, however twisted that ideology might have been, Voldemort built his power on fear, on promises of immortality, on appeals to the darkest impulses of those who felt themselves superior by accident of birth. The two Dark Lords shared certain superficial similarities. Of course, both were exceptionally powerful. Both were charismatic in their own ways. Both attracted followers willing to commit atrocities in their names. Both sought to reshape the wizarding world according to their vision. But the differences were profound. Grindelwald had been a seer. His visions of the future, particularly his vision of a catastrophic war in the non-magical world, had driven much of his ideology. He had genuinely believed, mistakenly, but genuinely, that wizard dominance was necessary to prevent greater suffering. His crimes were committed in service of what he perceived as a higher purpose. Voldemort, by contrast, served only himself. His obsession with immortality, his mutilation of his own soul through the creation of Horcruxes, his complete disregard for any life or value beyond his own power, these revealed a fundamentally different character. Where Grindelwald had been a zealot, Voldemort was a narcissist of the most extreme variety. Where Grindelwald had built a movement, Voldemort cultivated a cult of personality. Where Grindelwald had loved, yes, loved, however complicated and ultimately destructive that love proved to be, Voldemort was incapable of the emotion entirely. News of Voldemort's activities eventually reached even the highest cell of Nurmengard. How could it not? The guards, despite their instructions to maintain silence, were still human, still capable of being overheard, still subjects of the same world that Voldemort was terrorizing. Fragments of information filtered through, enough for Grindelwald to piece together the emergence of this new threat. One can only speculate as to Grindelwald's initial reaction. Did he feel a twisted pride that another had taken up the mantle he had been forced to relinquish? Did he feel contempt for Voldemort's methods, so crude compared to his own calculated campaigns? Or did he perhaps feel something closer to horror, recognizing in Voldemort's rise a dark mirror of his own youth, but without even the pretense of noble purpose? I suspect elements of all three, though again, one can only speculate. What is known, and this is documented in the few records that escaped Nurmengard's walls, is that Grindelwald followed Voldemort's rise with keen interest. Here was another wizard reshaping the world through force. Another individual whom society deemed too dangerous to exist in their ordered, comfortable reality. Another Dark Lord. But Grindelwald made no attempt to contact this new player. He sent no messages, offered no advice, made no overtures. This absence of action is itself profoundly significant, and we shall examine why presently. Consider the Death Eaters. Voldemort's inner circle. Fanatically loyal, at least when their master was powerful. Men and women who had embraced his ideology of blood supremacy, who had committed themselves to his cause with a fervor that bordered on religious devotion. Bellatrix Lestrange, Antonin Dolohov, Lucius Malfoy, the Carrow siblings, and yes, myself, though I played a role more complex than they ever suspected. These individuals, and others like them, worshipped Voldemort, but they were not ignorant of magical history. They knew of Grindelwald. They understood that their master's predecessor in the title of Dark Lord still lived, imprisoned but alive, possessing knowledge and experience that spanned decades. Why, then, did none of them make the pilgrimage to Nurmengard? Why did no Death Eater attempt to forge an alliance between the two greatest dark wizards of the modern age? The strategic value would have been immense. Grindelwald's knowledge, his connections to surviving followers across Europe, his understanding of ancient magic, combined with Voldemort's power and his army of Death Eaters. Such an alliance could have been devastating. The answer lies in Voldemort himself. You see, Tom Riddle and I use his true name deliberately, for names have power and truth should not be obscured by affectation. Tom Riddle possessed many qualities, but humility was not among them. To approach Grindelwald would have been to acknowledge him as something approaching an equal. It would have suggested that Voldemort required assistance, that his power was insufficient on its own. For a wizard whose entire identity was built upon being the greatest, the most powerful, the supreme magical being, such an acknowledgement was simply impossible. More than that, Voldemort would have seen Grindelwald as a potential rival rather than an ally. Even imprisoned, even defeated, the old Dark Lord represented a threat to Voldemort's absolute dominance. What if Grindelwald's followers, those who had survived and faded into obscurity, rallied to him again? What if the magical world began to compare the two Dark Lords and found Voldemort wanting in some respect? What if Grindelwald, with his superior experience and broader understanding of magic, attempted to supplant Voldemort's leadership? These possibilities, however remote, were intolerable to Voldemort's megalomaniacal psyche. Better to ignore Grindelwald entirely. Better to pretend that the old Dark Lord was irrelevant, forgotten, a relic of a bygone era. Better to ensure that no connection existed between them whatsoever. And so Voldemort forbade his followers from any contact with Ermengarde. Not explicitly, he was too clever for such obvious prohibition, but through implication, through ensuring that no one who served him would even consider such an action, through cultivating an atmosphere where suggesting such a thing would be tantamount to questioning Voldemort's supremacy. The Death Eaters, for their part, were content to follow this unspoken rule. They had their master. They required no other. But what of Grindelwald's view of Voldemort? Here we tread on firmer ground, for we have testimony reluctant, extracted under the most dire circumstances, but testimony nonetheless directly from Grindelwald himself. To understand his perspective, one must understand how Grindelwald's thinking had evolved during his long imprisonment. His original ideology, for all its flaws, had been cosmopolitan in a sense. He had not particularly cared about blood purity within the magical community. His followers had included purebloods and half-bloods alike. His focus had been on the divide between magical and non-magical humans, not on pedigree within the magical world itself. Voldemort's obsession with blood purity would have struck Grindelwald as provincial petty, a waste of magical potential. Why concern oneself with whether a wizard's grandmother was a muggle, when there were larger questions to consider? Why fracture the magical community over genealogy, when unity would serve any revolutionary purpose better? Moreover, Grindelwald had seen where such thinking led. He had witnessed the non-magical world's catastrophic war, the one he had foreseen, the one that had partially inspired his own campaigns. He had seen what happened when ideology based on racial superiority was pursued to its logical conclusion. The camps, the systematic murder, the reduction of human beings to categories and statistics. He had seen it, and even in his most zealous moments, he had never descended to quite that level of mechanized horror. Voldemort, Grindelwald recognized, would not hesitate at any atrocity. The creation of Horcruxes, alone the willful murder and soul-splitting required for such dark magic, demonstrated a moral void that Grindelwald, for all his crimes, did not quite possess. Grindelwald had killed for his vision. Voldemort killed for pleasure and power. The distinction mattered. Furthermore, Grindelwald understood something that Voldemort never grasped: the importance of genuine loyalty. Grindelwald's followers had believed in his cause. They had followed him because they shared his vision of the future, because he had convinced them that he was working toward something greater than himself. Many had been willing to die for that vision. Voldemort's Death Eaters, by contrast, followed him out of fear or ambition. They served because he was powerful, because he offered them status or protection, or the opportunity to indulge their worst impulses without consequence. Remove Voldemort's power, and his support evaporated instantly, as would be demonstrated twice, after his first defeat in 1981 and his final destruction in 1998. Grindelwald recognized Voldemort's approach as fundamentally unsustainable. A movement built on fear cannot endure. A cause that serves only one man's ego cannot outlast that man. Whatever Voldemort achieved would crumble the moment he fell. And so Grindelwald, had he been approached, would have refused any alliance. Not out of principle, let us not romanticize him, but out of pragmatism. He would have seen Voldemort as a poor investment, a losing proposition. A wizard whose ultimate defeat was inevitable because his methods guaranteed that he would face the world alone, without true allies, without genuine loyalty, without the foundation necessary for lasting change. This, I believe, is the first answer to why Grindelwald never joined with Voldemort. He would not have, even if asked. The two Dark Lords were fundamentally incompatible. The 1970s marked the height of Voldemort's first rise to power. Britain descended into chaos. Families were torn apart. The Ministry of Magic proved woefully inadequate to the task of containing the threat. Death Eaters operated with near impunity, protected by some within the government itself. It was a dark time, though not as dark as what would come later, after Voldemort's return. During these years, Grindelwald remained in his tower cell, an observer to the growing darkness. One wonders what he thought as he watched history, in some sense, repeat itself. Did he see echoes of his own campaign in Voldemort's tactics? Did he recognize the same patterns, the intimidation, the targeted killings, the slow erosion of civilized norms? The international magical community, having learned some lessons from Grindelwald's war, was more prepared this time. The International Confederation of Wizards monitored the situation in Britain closely. Other nations bolstered their defenses, wary that Voldemort's ambitions might expand beyond British borders as Grindelwald's had. But they also, shamefully, left Britain largely to manage its own crisis. The wounds from Grindelwald's war were still too fresh. No one wished to commit to another continental conflict. Nurmengard, during this period, became a curious footnote in magical history. The fortress still stood, still housed its single prisoner, but it had faded from public consciousness. A new generation had grown up knowing Grindelwald only as a name in history books, a boogeyman from their parents' youth. The prison required maintenance, yes, and guards, but it operated on the periphery of awareness. This obscurity served a purpose. Dumbledore, who had assumed unofficial responsibility for Grindelwald's continued imprisonment even as he battled Voldemort's rising power, understood that bringing attention to Grindelwald would be counterproductive. Better to let the old Dark Lord fade into irrelevance while dealing with the new threat. Better to ensure that no one thought to connect the two, to treat them as a continuum rather than as separate phenomena. And so Grindelwald's imprisonment continued, uninterrupted, through Voldemort's rise and his sudden fall in 1981. When Harry Potter survived the killing curse and Voldemort vanished, reduced to less than spirit, his body destroyed, his power scattered, the news eventually reached Nurmengard. One imagines Grindelwald's reaction to learning that the new Dark Lord had been defeated by an infant. The irony would not have been lost on him, the bitter humor of it, the proof, perhaps, that power built on fear and cruelty was inherently unstable. For 13 years, both Dark Lords remained in their respective states of defeat. Grindelwald in his cell, Voldemort in his disembodied exile. The wizarding world enjoyed a respite, though an uneasy one. Those who understood the true nature of Voldemort's Horcruxes knew he was not truly gone. But for most, It seemed that the darkness had passed. They were wrong, of course. Darkness never truly passes. It merely waits. 1994. Voldemort's return, achieved through dark magic and Peter Pettigrew's repulsive servitude. Once again, the dark mark burned in the sky. Once again, Death Eaters answered their master's call. Once again, Britain faced a terror that the Ministry refused to acknowledge. Cornelius Fudge's denialism, the Daily Prophet's propaganda, the systematic undermining of Dumbledore's warnings, all of it creating a perfect storm that allowed Voldemort to rebuild his power in the shadows. But something had changed. Voldemort's second rise was marked by a desperation absent from his first. He had experienced death, or near enough to it, and it had not humbled him, but rather intensified his fear. His obsession with immortality deepened. His tactics became more reckless. His need to prove his invincibility drove him to actions that, paradoxically, revealed his vulnerability. Among these actions was his pursuit of the Elder Wand. Ah, yes, the Elder Wand, the Death Stick, the Wand of Destiny, one of the 3 Deathly Hallows. Though Voldemort did not understand the full significance of that designation, being ignorant of the tale of the 3 brothers and its deeper implications. He knew only that the wand was said to be unbeatable, and for a wizard who had already been beaten by an infant, no less the appeal was irresistible. Voldemort's research into the wand's location was methodical. He investigated rumors. He interrogated wand-makers, most notably the unfortunate Grigorovich. He pieced together the wand's history, tracing it through various owners over the centuries. And eventually, inevitably, his investigation led him to a singular conclusion. Albus Dumbledore had possessed the Elder Wand, taken from Gellert Grindelwald in their legendary duel of 90. This realization presented Voldemort with a problem. Dumbledore was dead, killed by Severus Snape on top of the astronomy tower. Though the true circumstances of that death were more complex than Voldemort understood. If the wand passed through defeat, and Dumbledore had died defeated by Snape, then Snape was the wand's master. Voldemort, in his ignorance, would later murder Snape under this misapprehension, not realizing that Draco Malfoy had actually disarmed Dumbledore before Snape's arrival. But before any of that, Voldemort needed to confirm the wand's history. He needed to know beyond doubt that Dumbledore had indeed taken it from Grindelwald. There was only one source for that information. The old Dark Lord himself. March 1998. The Wizarding World had descended into open war. Voldemort had seized control of the Ministry. Hogwarts had become a battleground. Harry Potter, the boy who had survived, was in hiding, searching desperately for Horcruxes. The end approached, though no one knew quite how it would arrive. Voldemort traveled to Austria, to Nuremberg, to the cell at the top of the tower where Grindelwald had spent more than 50 years in isolation. The guards, those who survived Voldemort's arrival, reported seeing him ascend the stairs alone, leaving his Death Eaters below. This meeting, he determined, would be private. Picture that encounter, if you possess the imagination. 2 Dark Lords, face to face for the first and only time. Voldemort in his prime, or what passed for it in his resurrected, homunculus body, powerful, feared, commanding an army. Grindelwald, ancient by comparison, withered by time and imprisonment, yet still possessed of that formidable intellect and those piercing eyes that had once commanded thousands. Voldemort did not bother with pleasantries. Why would he? He demanded information about the Elder Wand. He wanted confirmation that Dumbledore had taken it. He wanted to know where Dumbledore was buried, for he intended to steal the wand from the tomb. And Grindelwald, who had spent decades reconsidering his choices, who had developed something approaching wisdom through suffering, who understood in a way that Voldemort never would the futility of power pursued for its own sake. Grindelwald refused to answer. Think on that for a moment. An elderly prisoner, wandless, powerless, facing the most dangerous wizard in the world. Voldemort could have tortured him, could have used legilimency to rip the information from his mind, could have employed any number of dark arts to extract what he wanted. Grindelwald knew all of this. He understood the consequences of defiance, and yet he remained silent. Why? Not, I think, out of loyalty to Dumbledore, though perhaps some vestige of his old feelings played a role. Not out of principle, for Grindelwald had never been particularly principled. No, I believe Grindelwald refused for a simpler, more profound reason. He recognized that Voldemort's pursuit of the Elder Wand was a fool's errand. He understood that the wand would not save Voldemort, could not provide what he truly lacked. He saw in Voldemort's desperation a reflection of his own youthful arrogance, and he would not contribute to it. Moreover, and this is speculation, but grounded in an understanding of Grindelwald's character, he may have protected Dumbledore's memory in that moment, not from sentiment, but from a recognition that Dumbledore, despite everything, despite the betrayal and the defeat and the long imprisonment, had been right about the most important things. That love mattered, that the ends did not justify any means, that power without wisdom was worse than useless. It was actively dangerous. Grindelwald's final act of defiance was not a redemption. Do not mistake me on this point. He remained a war criminal, a murderer, a wizard whose crimes could not be erased by one moment of courage. But it was, perhaps, an acknowledgment of truth, a recognition that the path he and Voldemort had chosen led only to destruction. Voldemort's response was entirely predictable. He killed Grindelwald, the killing curse, cast with barely a thought. The old Dark Lord died in his cell, taking his secrets with him. Voldemort, enraged by the resistance, departed Nermengard without what he sought. He would later learn of Dumbledore's tomb through other means, but the interaction with Grindelwald had yielded nothing, except perhaps one thing, a demonstration of something Voldemort would never understand, that even powerless, even defeated, a wizard could still choose, could still deny the seemingly invincible, could still, in some small way, shape events through simple refusal. Grindelwald's death marked the end of an era. The last connection to the magical wars of the early 20th century was severed, and within months Voldemort himself would fall at the Battle of Hogwarts, destroyed by his own rebounding curse, undone by magic he had never troubled to understand. So we return to the question that began this examination. Why did Grindelwald never join with Voldemort? Why did these two Dark Lords, who might have formed an alliance that could have reshaped the magical world, never unite their powers? The answer, as I have demonstrated, operates on multiple levels. First, practically, Voldemort's psychology made such an alliance impossible. His narcissism, his inability to see other wizards as anything but tools or obstacles, his fear of potential rivals, all of this precluded genuine partnership. He could command followers through fear, but he could not work with equals. And Grindelwald, even imprisoned and powerless, was too significant a figure to be treated as a mere subordinate. Second, philosophically, the two wizards, despite superficial similarities, pursued fundamentally different goals through incompatible methods. Grindelwald had been a revolutionary ideologue, however misguided. Voldemort was a supremacist focused on personal immortality and blood purity. Their worldviews, examined closely, had almost nothing in common beyond a willingness to use violence to achieve their aims. Third, chronologically, by the time Voldemort rose to power, Grindelwald had evolved beyond his younger self's certainties. The decades of imprisonment had changed him in ways that made him fundamentally unsuited to serve another Dark Lord's ambitions. He had seen the futility of his own path. Why would he enable another's? Fourth, strategically, Grindelwald understood that Voldemort was doomed to fail. The methods the younger Dark Lord employed, ruling through terror, fragmenting his soul, treating his followers as disposable assets, guaranteed eventual defeat. Joining such a cause would have been pointless, even had the opportunity arisen. And finally, personally, at the end, when faced with Voldemort directly, Grindelwald chose to protect information rather than save himself. This act, his refusal to reveal the Elder One's location, demonstrates that whatever he had become during his long imprisonment, he was no longer the wizard who would have allied with someone like Voldemort. He had not become good, precisely, but he had perhaps become something approaching wise. Both Grindelwald and Voldemort are gone now. Both defeated, both dead. The wizarding world has moved beyond them, though their shadows linger in unexpected ways. The laws reformed in response to their reigns of terror. The families destroyed by their actions. The trauma passed down through generations. These things remain long after the individuals themselves have passed into history and legend. It is tempting to compare the two, to debate which was more dangerous, more powerful, more evil. Such comparisons are ultimately futile. They were both sufficiently terrible that the distinctions hardly matter to their victims. But for those of us who study such things, who seek to understand how individual wizards can accumulate such power and cause such devastation, the differences between them illuminate important truths about the nature of dark magic and those who practice it. Grindelwald represented the danger of ideological certainty combined with tremendous power. He believed he was working toward a better world, and that belief justified every atrocity in his mind. His tragedy, if one can speak of tragedy in relation to such a figure, was that he achieved clarity only after irrevocable damage had been done. Decades too late, he understood that his vision had been false, his methods monstrous, his certainty misplaced. Voldemort represented a purer form of evil, power pursued for its own sake, without even the pretense of higher purpose. His obsession with immortality revealed the fundamental emptiness at his core. He feared death so intensely that he could never truly live. He commanded followers, but knew no friendship. He inspired terror, but understood nothing of loyalty or love. And ultimately, these deficiencies destroyed him more surely than any spell. But the two never allied was, in hindsight, fortunate for the wizarding world. Together, they might have been unstoppable. Separated by ideology, chronology, and psychology, they were merely terrible, separately defeatable, individually destructive, but ultimately finite in their damage. What lessons, then, can be extracted from this examination of two Dark Lords who never met as allies? What understanding can be gleaned from the story of Grindelwald's imprisonment and his refusal to join with power, divorced from wisdom and compassion, inevitably corrupts and destroys? Both Grindelwald and Voldemort demonstrated this truth, though in different ways and at different times. Grindelwald learned it through suffering and reflection. Voldemort never learned it at all, dying as ignorant as he had lived. Ideology, however compelling, cannot justify atrocity. Grindelwald's vision of wizard dominance for the greater good was fundamentally flawed, because it required treating sentient beings as obstacles to be removed, rather than as individuals with inherent value. Once one accepts that the end justifies any means, there are no means too horrific to employ. Fear is an unstable foundation for power. Voldemort's Death Eaters followed him while he was strong and abandoned him the moment he appeared weak. Contrast this with Grindelwald's followers, many of whom remained loyal to his ideals even after his defeat. Love and loyalty, Dumbledore understood, were stronger than fear, a lesson both Dark Lords failed to learn, though Grindelwald came closest to grasping it at the end. Change, even in the apparently irredeemable, remains possible. Grindelwald's refusal to help Voldemort, his protection of Dumbledore's memory, his final act of defiance, these suggest that even after decades of imprisonment, even after countless crimes, some capacity for different choices remained. This does not erase his guilt or redeem his actions, but it does suggest that human nature, wizard nature, is more complex than simple categories of good and evil might suggest. And, perhaps most significantly, the greatest dangers often come not from those who know they are doing evil, but from those who believe they are doing good. Grindelwald was, in many ways, more dangerous than Voldemort, precisely because he offered his followers a vision, a purpose, a sense that their actions served something greater than themselves. Voldemort offered only power and fear. One can resist fear more easily than one can resist the seductive pull of believing oneself to be on the side of righteousness. The story of Gellert Grindelwald, after his defeat, is, ultimately, a story about the long, difficult process of recognizing one's own failures. It took decades. It required isolation and suffering. It was never complete, he remained, until his death, a criminal and a murderer. But the arc of his imprisonment demonstrates something that Voldemort's story never did. That understanding can grow even from terrible mistakes. That wisdom can emerge even from the ruins of catastrophic failure. Whether that understanding came too late to matter is a question I leave for you to contemplate. One final consideration remains. The historical record of Grindelwald's post-defeat existence is remarkably sparse. Official ministry documents say little beyond confirming his imprisonment and eventual death. The memoirs of those who lived through both Grindelwald's and Voldemort's eras rarely mention Grindelwald's continued existence at all, treating him as though he ceased to exist the moment Dumbledore defeated him. This silence is itself instructive. The wizarding world wanted to forget Grindelwald. His defeat represented closure, the end of a dark chapter. To acknowledge his continued existence, to think of him sitting in his cell year after year, was to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, punishment, and whether either truly mattered in the face of his crimes. So history chose to forget. The textbooks recorded his rise and fall, but glossed over what came after. The next generation learned his name as a cautionary tale, but knew nothing of the man himself. His thoughts during his long imprisonment, his evolution from zealot to something more contemplative. This erasure served a purpose. It allowed society to move forward without the burden of complexity. But in doing so, the wizarding world lost access to potentially valuable knowledge. Grindelwald understood things about dark magic, about the seductive nature of power, about the mechanisms through which charismatic leaders build and maintain support that could have informed responses to Voldemort's rise. His insights, however tainted by their source, might have proven useful. Dumbledore, perhaps, recognized this. His decision to personally maintain Grindelwald's imprisonment, to ensure no contact with the outside world, suggests not merely a desire to keep Grindelwald contained, but also to protect him from exploitation. Had Voldemort learned of the potential resource Grindelwald represented, had other dark wizards sought to free him or extract his knowledge, the consequences could have been severe. So the silence was, perhaps, necessary. But it was also a loss. The full story of Grindelwald's post-defeat existence may never be completely known. What thoughts occupied his mind during those long decades? What conclusions did he reach about magic, power, and the choices he had made? What would he have said had anyone asked about the nature of darkness and those drawn to it? We have fragments. We have his final confrontation with Voldemort. We have rumors and speculation. We have educated guesses based on the limited evidence available. But the complete picture remains obscured by time, by deliberate obscurity, by the simple fact that for more than half a century Grindelwald spoke to no one. Perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps some knowledge should remain buried with those who possessed it. Perhaps the world is better for not knowing every thought that passed through the mind of the 20th century's first Dark Lord as he contemplated his failures in solitude. That knowledge is gone now, lost with Grindelwald's death in his cell. Another casualty of the war between light and darkness, though of a different sort than most. And so we conclude our examination of Grindelwald's untold story and his relationship, or rather, his lack thereof, with Lord Voldemort. We have traced his journey from defeat to imprisonment to his final defiant act. We have explored the reasons why two wizards who might have allied never did. We have considered the differences between them, the evolution of Grindelwald's thinking, and the lessons that might be drawn from their separate paths. What remains is for you to digest this information, to consider it, to question it, as all presented knowledge should be questioned. I have provided you with facts, with analysis, with informed speculation, where facts were unavailable. I have not provided you with comfortable conclusions, or simple moral lessons, for the reality of Grindelwald and Voldemort defies such simplification. They were both terrible wizards who caused immense suffering. They were both brilliant in their own ways. They were both defeated by forces they failed to understand. Grindelwald by love and remorse, Voldemort by love and self-destruction. Their stories intertwine with the broader history of the 20th century wizarding world, and yet they remain, in crucial ways, separate narratives. Grindelwald never joined Voldemort, because such a joining was impossible practically, philosophically, psychologically. They were dark lords of different varieties, pursuing different goals through incompatible means, separated by time and temperament, and the simple fact that one had learned lessons, the other never would. The wizarding world is fortunate they never allied. Whether it is wiser for having seen both of them rise and fall is a question I cannot answer. Wisdom, like justice, is a concept more easily discussed than achieved. But knowledge we now possess. The knowledge of what happened to Gellert Grindelwald after his defeat. The knowledge of why he and Voldemort never joined forces. The knowledge of how he faced his final test and chose, perhaps for the first time in decades, to act in a way that served something beyond his own interests. That knowledge is worth something. What exactly it is worth, I leave for you to determine. The silence stretches, heavy with the weight of dark history finally illuminated.